week, but all year long here at the museum. So welcome to Oshkosh and to EAA. We're so glad that you're here with us. You're here today to see Deep Sea 129, the Cold War Casualty. Before I continue, and I don't want to forget, make sure you turn off or silence your phones, please, at this time. A U.S. Navy veteran of the Vietnam era, Rex Gray was a crew member on EC 121, Supper Connie, operating in Vietnam and the Sea of Japan. Retired from the airlines and now serving as a pilot and docent on the aluminum overcast EAA's B-17. Please give a warm welcome to Rex Gray.
Okay, so if you're from Oshkosh or in the Central Time Zone, when you went to bed April 14th, 1969, if you were of my age or maybe a little bit younger, this was probably what you were thinking about. 10 o'clock at night, April 14th, 1969. Probably thinking about your taxes that were due the next morning. That's how you went to bed. Halfway around the world, in North Korea, they were celebrating Day of the Sun, a national holiday, a very big deal. And it was about, when you went to bed at 10, it was about noon over there in North Korea. They were celebrating this guy's birthday, Kim Il-sung, who was the supreme ruler of North Korea. He'd been appointed by Stalin at the end of the war. When we separated North Korea and South Korea, he appointed this man to be the ruler over North Korea. North Korea in the 60s was referred to as a hermit kingdom. They were very isolated, and this guy ruled with an iron fist. And this right here is Lieutenant Commander James Overstreet, 34 when you went to bed in 1969, April 14th. 5 days earlier, he was 33. He just turned 34. He was an EWAC, which stands for Electronic Warfare Aircraft Commander on a EC-121 Super Connie. And for a squadron called DQ-1, a reconnaissance squadron, fleet reconnaissance squadron based out of, at that time, Atsugi, Japan. Lieutenant Commander Overstreet was in charge of a 31-man crew. There were 31 of them on board the airplane, and they were flying a mission, what called a PARPRO mission, Peacetime Aerial Reconnaissance, along the offshore of North Korea, 50 miles to 80 miles offshore of North Korea. So you got up in the morning thinking about your taxes. You went out to the driveway to get the newspaper because that's what you did in 1969. You didn't look on the internet, and this is what you saw when you got up in the morning, if you were around. North Korea claims U.S. airplane shot down, and 31 sailors, or 30 sailors and 1 Marine lost. So that's what happened while you were in bed. This is the artist's depiction of maybe what happened. So that's how you woke up the next morning in the Cold War. So let's stop for a minute. I'd like to say welcome. Thanks for joining me today. My involvement is I happened to be there a few days after this happened in the same type airplane for a show of military power. So it's all kind of been a very personal thing, flying over these spots where these guys lost their lives. So that's how I ended up here. As currently said, I'm a pilot docent. I was a DW-1, a Connie outfit at the same at that time during the Cold War. So let me get one more thing here I got to get out to keep track where I'm at. Anyway, is there anybody here from DQ-1? Nobody from DQ-1? Anybody that has a family connection to any of these people? No. Okay, interesting. Okay, so this is 1969. It's VW-1 aircraft. There we are in Da Nang. And in '69, I was 20 years old, doing a similar job that these guys did with VQ-1. So that's what was going on in 1969 in my life. This is what's going on in the world. This is President Nixon, or soon-to-be President Nixon, shaking hands with Lyndon Johnson at the inauguration in January of 1969. So Nixon was coming into power. He was going to be the 37th president, and his platform was, we're not going to take any stuff from North Korea. We're going to be a law and order campaign platform, and we're not going to put up with any of the shenanigans that we've been having from North Korea. Because what had been happening was this right here. This is the USS Pueblo, and that's on the river right now, right at this very moment in North Korea, the capital of North Korea, Pyongyang, and that's where it's at now. It's a tourist attraction. It's the second oldest ship still commissioned in the U.S. Navy. The oldest ship would be the USS Constitution in Boston. This is the second oldest. It's still commissioned. And it is set there as a tourist attraction because in January of 1968, it was on a similar mission, and it was to go along the shore of North Korea on what's called an ELINT mission, which is electronic intelligence gathering, or signal intelligence gathering. So the Pueblo was doing that in 1968, and they would go almost, I think the closest they got to shore was actually 12.8 miles. They were to stay outside of 12 miles. And I don't know if any of you remember this incident or not, but it was a pretty big deal. The North Koreans come out, surrounded the boat at 17 miles. They had moved out to 17 miles at night. They surrounded the boat, they brought out some MiGs, they did some shooting, and finally the crew ended up surrendering. They drugged the boat into the 7-mile limit, and then they boarded the boat and drug it into shore, and then turned it into a tourist attraction, and then put the crew in a prisoner of war camp. Here's a picture of the crew, and they were in a prisoner of war camp until December of 1968. So this is what the previous administration had been working with. North Korea taking our ship, putting our guys in prisoner of war camp, torturing them, and the only way we got them back was they signed a confession, we signed a confession as a country, the president, and we did all that to get our guys back. There were 83 of them. One of them lost his life during the boarding, and the others were released in December of '88. So this is what Nixon was running against when campaigning for president. We're not going to have North Korea do like they did with the Pueblo. You notice these guys, I picked this picture because this was taken just shortly before their release, not the entire crew, but they're giving the Hawaiian good luck sign. At least that's what they told the North Koreans it was. So if you look carefully, they're all giving the North Koreans the Hawaiian good luck sign. The North Koreans didn't figure that out till later, obviously. So, so basically, that was what's going on with the Pueblo. Now let's talk about the VQ-1, Fleet Air Recon Squadron, based in Atsugi. And you know, I could take you back to the picture of VW-1. This is actually, I think that might be PR-21, but that's a VW-1 or VQ-1 airplane. And it was radar domes. There's an APS-20 radar on the top, APS-45 on the bottom. You know, the radar of the day. But these guys at I would see these guys in Da Nang quite a bit. These guys at VQ-1, they had all those antennas on the back of the airplane. And we referred to them as the spooks because they were doing the spy stuff. So they had an airplane just covered with antennas for their ELIT missions. And today, they're actually doing the same mission. They're based out of Whidbey Island, and they fly EA-3. which is an A3 with electronic surveillance. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. The other thing that they did was Da Nang deployments. So they frequently deployed to Da Nang, EA3 picture right there. That's what they fly nowadays. And actually, when this incident happened, the EA3 was coming on. In fact, the EA3 flew its first mission the same day that this incident happened. Da Nang, that was the other detachment they did. So they would go to Da Nang, and they would do similar things that we did in VW1 in Da Nang, which is you go up in the Gulf of Tonkin, you fly back and forth, and you look for MiGs, or you look for boats that are racing across the water really fast. And we could spot those things with our radar coming out of Hanoi and Haiphong, and that's what these guys were doing, Da Nang. So, and the other thing they would do was the Beggar Shadow mission. The Beggar Shadow mission was the ELINT mission along the coastline of North Korea. And so that was their other mission. The guys, talking to a few crew members and stuff that are still living, the Beggar Shadow mission was the one that nobody wanted. They would rather go to the war zone. And they'd rather go to Da Nang. And Da Nang, it wasn't any piece of cake. You'd take small arms fire frequently on takeoff. You know, nothing more than usually an annoyance, a bunch of holes in the radome. It's a pretty big target for anybody to hit. So that was not uncommon. They lost an airplane in Da Nang. This same squadron, VQ-1 in 1970. Da Nang at that time was the busiest airport in the world, and they were coming in on 2 engines, had 2 engines out, and somebody cut in front of them by one reason or another, accident, and they had to go around, and unsuccessful. And they lost the airplane and the whole crew. This same squadron actually, VQ-1. So just about a week before they flew the Beggar Shadow mission, let me back up for a minute here. My purpose today is to honor this crew. You know, we'll talk about the history and exactly what happened, but I really want to kind of put a personal face on who these guys were. So I'll be talking a lot about different crew members. And if you were here at the beginning, that slideshow, most of those pictures of the slideshow, most of those guys were crew members on the airplane. Almost all of them were crew members on Deep Sea 129. So anyway, this particular crew, Lieutenant Commander Overstreet's crew, had just flown to Da Nang detachment, and this was a party a week before the Beggar Shadow mission. And the average age of the crew, 25. So these were a bunch of young people. A lot of them were married, a lot of them had families, and so they were, you know, just a bunch of young guys doing their service in Japan. Back corner there, up against the wall, standing up, the guy to the left standing up, Lieutenant J.G. Rebar. Lieutenant Rebar had 1,000 hours VQ-1. As a second pilot in the Connie, was getting ready to probably check out as an EWAC, Electronic Weapons Aircraft Commander. So if he was at Oshkosh today, he would be just a little bit older than me, about 75 here, walking around enjoying the day. This is Lieutenant Rebar coming home. He was one of 2 survivors. And they picked up Lieutenant Rebar and Sweeney, who was a mechanic, and Lieutenant Rebar, they were really not very much to identify him, but they did manage to get a dental identification on him. They picked him up the 20th. He left behind a wife and a very, very young son. About, I think he was about a year old at the time of this accident. Let's talk about the mission a little bit, or the airplane, excuse me. We'll talk about the airplane here a little bit. An EC-121, it was an EC-121M. I'm not sure if this is this is number 20, this is PR-21, so that would be the same airplane. Lots of antennas on the back. Usually, you know, in the research here on this program, I've been looking at a lot of stuff for quite a few weeks. There's a report out there for those of you that are interested in digging in more, there's a report out there called an NSA document labeled Top Secret, Declassified, and I thought that was going to be a great source of information. Well, it was written in 1989 by somebody that was writing some sort of historical official report, and a lot of the information is incorrect. One of the more incorrect pieces of information was they said that the airplane was double crewed and that it was a big deal. There were 31, there only should have been 15, and it was the Navy's fault and everything else. That was not the case. I've talked to pilots that were in VQ1 at that time. They said the typical mission was usually 28 to 35 crew members. You're going flying, not only are you doing the mission, but you're doing training. That's what you do, especially on a peacetime mission. So, typical mission would be around 30 crew members. This mission had 23 enlisted and 8 officers. Everybody was in the Navy except one, Master Sergeant Hugh Lynch. We'll talk about him in a few minutes. The oldest was 38. The youngest was a new airman trainee. He was 20. And Gene Graham, he was 20, very young, pretty new to the squadron. And Lieutenant Zima, John Zima, he was an evaluator, and he was the oldest at 38. A little bit about the Connie, big 4-engine airplane. There's just some stats on it. A couple things, 143,000 pound gross weight on takeoff, a little bit less than your Boeing 737. The Boeing 737 newer models, NGs and so forth, weigh about 20,000 pounds more, but that's about the 737 weight. 4 Wright R3350s, 3,400 horsepower, had these things on them called power recovery turbines, which took the exhaust gases, drove a turbine, give you extra power, and made a big, huge flame out the pipe, out the back, and which in this instance had some consequence. 4,200 mile range, not uncommon. 12-hour mission, not unusual. So an 8.5-hour mission, that's what these guys were planning, was also not unusual. The crew quarters. At the time, it seemed pretty spacious, but not really. I forgot my pointer, but the pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, this was an engineer's airplane. A lot of stuff that the engineer was responsible for. In the middle of the airplane, you'll see a galley. Guys that actually cook meals. It wasn't box lunches. You got a hot plate, you go to the galley, you get chicken, you get steak, you get lobster. You know, you always got the best stuff, especially if you were in Da Nang, because you're in a war zone. So you go to the chow hall, you get a big box of food, you take it out to the airplane, and whoever was the best cook on the airplane would cook for the entire crew. There was a little table that set 4 people, and they'd feed 4 at a time, and you'd smell fried potatoes and onions cooking all through the airplane. Bunks in the back and bunks in the front, and usually there'd be 2 or 3 radar operators, and then maybe 2 or 3 E-Link guys listening, and then a radioman, a navigator, relief flight engineers, relief co-pilots, 1 aircraft commander generally. In the middle, Lieutenant Commander Overstreet. This is day before his flight. He went in for a briefing. They were planning on departing at 7 a.m., so, you know, pilots generally don't like to get up that early. So they went in for the brief the night before at 9 o'clock. There's a Navy investigation paper that was done after this, talks about the hour-long brief, and the JAG Navy guys are interviewing the squadron commander and the weather guy and everybody involved, the intelligence guy, about this briefing. All that indicates there was an hour briefing. Talking to Joe Overstreet, Lieutenant Commander Joe Overstreet, who was 7 years old when he lost his father, digging out information and talking to his mother and so forth. That wasn't exactly how it went. By the way, I forgot, I'm not using this mic. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So, Lieutenant Commander Overstreet, he did his hour briefing, And then he spent the rest of the day in the CO's office discussing this mission. He did not want to go. He was not very happy about this mission for some particular reason. A couple of the reasons were there had been warnings put out April 11th and April 13th about possible action from North Korea. And it said, be careful. So they had adjusted the mission profile a little bit based on that. But since they had flown 190 missions already this year, beggar shadow missions, 190 beggar shadow missions, they thought it was still a reasonable risk. So that night, Lieutenant Commander Overstreet had been in the squadron for a couple of years, had 4,500 hours in the Connie, very experienced. So that night he told his wife, he says, hey, this might be the one. Let's review our paperwork. So he reviewed all his stuff with his wife before he went. And then he called his father in Brooklyn, Mississippi. And you got to remember, this is 1969 in Japan. So calling Brooklyn, Mississippi isn't like picking up your cell phone today. It was a big deal. So he called his dad in Brooklyn, Mississippi, and according to his dad, they talked about the taxes for a while, and then he talked to his dad about the mission. He said he had this mission, he didn't like it, it wasn't looking good, and this could be a bad one. So that was the night before. This was what the mission looked like. They were to take off from Atsugi, head across the Sea of Japan, up to the northeast corner there by Russia, and go down, make 2.5 orbits, and then return to Osan. So this was kind of like a gravy run to some level, because Osan was a good liberty spot, Seoul, Korea. There was one or two guys actually bumped other crew members off so they could go to Osan for the overnight. They were to overnight Osan and then come back the next day to Atsugi. The typical, after the Pueblo incident, the PAR-PRO missions were moved 80 miles offshore. A few months later, they decided, well, things are not that bad anymore, so we can go back to a normal 30 miles offshore. Then they went to 40 miles offshore, and then this mission come up, they had some intelligence from North Korea that they thought made it sound bad, so they told them to stay 50 miles offshore. Lieutenant Commander Overstreet was known by his fellow crew members, talked to a flight engineer that had flown with him, and another aircraft commander as a rather by-the-book guy. He did it exactly by the book. So 50 miles offshore, most likely that's where he was at. So anyway, back to the night before the mission. This is John Miller III, CT3, which is a communications tech, 3rd class. His specialty was Morse code and Korean language. He was one of 9 guys from not the squadron. He was not with VQ-1. He was from the Naval Security Group. Naval Security Group was a special ELINT, or electronic intelligence agency, that specialized in languages. So these guys would frequently fly with VQ-1. John Miller had gone to Da Nang several times. He was a short timer. He was due out in June. One of the chiefs in NSG said, John, don't fly. You don't have to fly. This was well before that. He says, take it easy the last few days. But John felt obligated to do the flying, and so he went on the mission. His wife, he told his wife the night before, and his wife Donna, still living, told his wife the night before that he didn't want to go. He said this was a bad one, and I don't know. There's pieces of intelligence out there that have not yet been released. But this was a bad mission. He did not want to go. His wife told him to call in sick. Well, that wasn't the kind of guy John was. He wasn't going to call in sick unless he was sick. He wasn't sick. This is a picture of John, Donna, and Andrea known as Andy. She was a year and a half old at that time. John and Donna met in college, dated for a couple years. He joined the Navy. They ended up in Pensacola, and then he got orders to Japan. And he was going to take off to Japan, and she says, "No way, I'm going to Japan with you." When she was growing up, she had an uncle that was in World War II in the occupation, and he had all these pictures of Japan, and she was just enthralled with the opportunity to go to Japan. So she went to Japan with him. In fact, when she went to Japan, she was pregnant. Andrea was born in Japan. Little side note about Andrea. She graduated from high school at 15, so it shows how smart she probably was. Tried to get into Annapolis. They wouldn't take her because they wouldn't take anybody that was 16 years old, and that's how old she would have been. John and Donna, this picture was actually about a week before the accident. John and Donna would travel all around Japan. They absolutely loved it. John climbed Mount Fuji. They were English teachers. They had university students over to their house a couple times a month and would teach English. John was a guitar player, basketball, well respected by all crew members. And like I said, a short timer that didn't want to go on the mission, but ended up there. This is just kind of some crew pictures. Tim McNeil, 23 years old, so probably at 5 o'clock, mission morning, 5 o'clock on mission morning, I'm suspecting that Tim McNeil here and Denny Harrigan, he was 23, an ATR2, and Gene Graham here, who was 20, he was a new guy, brand new guy, and I suspect that those three guys, or maybe somebody else on the crew, could have been somebody, three or four guys, they go to the chow hall, and they had these big metal coolers loaded up with coffee and juice, and then you get boxes and boxes of food, and you'd load all that stuff and take it back to the airplane. That's what they'd be doing at 5 o'clock, April 15th. And then this guy right here, Richard Kincaid, that would be what I would be doing. He was an ATR2, same as I was, and he was a crew leader. So he would be out at the airplane at 5 o'clock, pre-flighting electronics equipment, and then there was a big status board, and he'd be designing the watches, because he had 31 crew members, and several of them electronic and E-Link guys, so you had to have a watch system. So everybody would be on the radar a certain amount of time and so forth. So he would be out there a couple hours before planning all the watches. This guy out here, Connors, Balliard Connors from, he was from Ohio, I believe. He was what you call a lifer. He was a first class guy, ADR1, and he was a flight engineer. Somebody that was probably pretty close to Lieutenant Commander Overstreet, because besides the aircraft commander, the flight engineer was probably the most important guy on a Connie. There's a lot of stuff going on. So we had 3 flight engineers on board this particular flight. I suspect one of them is maybe getting a check right. It's 2 chiefs and Connors flew quite a bit with Overstreet. So he probably showed up same time, 5 o'clock in the morning, to pre-flight the airplane. Lieutenant Commander Overstreet, the co-pilot, the navigator, probably a couple of the E-Link guys, they were going to the last minute weather briefing at about 5:50 or so. They were getting their weather brief while the guys are getting the airplane ready. This guy right here, Hugh Lynch, he was the only non-Navy guy, Staff Sergeant Hugh Lynch, 36 years old, from Ohio, red-headed Irish guy, again, a long-time Marine. He wasn't supposed to go on a mission. He showed up late. He showed up at a little after 6. It was a last-minute call. Somebody called in sick. They called, and he was at the NSG group. He was a Korean linguist and Russian, but he showed up sick, or somebody called in sick, so they called him, says, "Hey, we need you to cover this trip." So he dashed off